In this mini lesson, we will be talking about what children understand regarding exceptionalities and what teachers of young children can do to help foster healthy attitudes in young children. First off, let's start by defining the term exceptionality. The U.S. Department of Education defines an exceptionality as a pattern of strengths and needs common to groups of students. These strengths and needs may be cognitive, emotional, behavioral, medical, social, and physical. Students with an exceptionality may access a range of school-based services depending on degree of severity. A more simple way of saying this is that a child with an exceptionality is a child who learns and develops outside of what we consider to be typical learning and development. There are lots of reasons why inclusive early childhood classrooms can be beneficial to all children. For one thing, it benefits the child with an exceptionality because of the increased potential for peer models. This means that children who need a little bit of extra support can get that support by another child the same age. If you think of Vygotsky's idea about scaffolding, we typically think of a teacher, a parent, or an older person offering scaffolding to a younger person. But that doesn't have to always be the case. In the case of an inclusive classroom, a typically developing peer model can offer scaffolding to a child with an exceptionality. Inclusive classrooms can also make all children feel better about themselves and improve their social involvement. It really helps all people to be able to learn how to get along with other people with a wide variety of abilities. And again, that applies to people with exceptionalities and also people with a more typical trajectory of learning and development. You'll notice when I'm using the language, I'm using people first language. Instead of saying an exceptional child or disabled child, we use the term children with exceptionality, person with a disability, and we always keep the person first. So we'll talk briefly here about what young children understand regarding physical differences among people. Absolutely, 2-year-olds are noticing differences. They can see if someone, like in the picture, is using crutches to walk, or in this boy's case, to run in a race. We might see the young children pointing or staring or even imitating what they see. And we know that sometimes children feel uncomfortable when they notice differences, and that's okay. That's just part of the learning process for the young child. And so what we don't want to do is to just sweep this discomfort under the rug and pretend it's not there, because what we're doing is just reinforcing the uncomfortable feeling the child might have by telling that child, oh, this is something we can't even talk about. It's much better to talk openly and say, oh, right, yeah, I see that boy in the race and he's using crutches, isn't he? And then that could open the door for a discussion about that. If it's appropriate, it's okay sometimes to have the child directly speak to another person and say, oh, I'm curious about your crutches. Can you tell me about them? We often hear from people with disabilities that they say it's much worse when adults tell children to look away or to stop asking questions than it is if a well-intentioned young child just asks a question. And so definitely keep that in mind when you are working with young children and they are starting to explore some of these issues. So what about our preschoolers? The cognitive understanding of preschoolers is more sophisticated and complex than the cognitive understanding of toddlers, so they are able to see a wider range of shared abilities and similarities among people as well as differences. They might be curious about equipment and devices, especially if it's something new to the child. The child might just, really wonder how it works and what it's all about, and that's absolutely fine, that's normal, that's great. If you have a new child who is joining your classroom, who uses a piece of adaptive equipment, it could be very useful if you could obtain some of that equipment and have it available to the children in your classroom so they can explore it, try it on, use it themselves, and that will help answer some of their questions. Also, before a child with a disability joins your classroom, you could talk to the other children to let the children know what to expect and to let them know that the child was joining the classroom soon, and always highlight shared interests and abilities, as well as letting the children know what they might notice in terms of adaptive equipment or behavior that's different from what they've observed in the past. And so you can do this during group time before a new child joins your classroom. An example from my own life where this did not happen, and I wish it had happened, was when my young son was on a t-ball team, and he was about 4 or 5 at the time, and we took him to t-ball. And there was a boy who was on the team who was on the autism spectrum. And while the other children were expected to stand in their position, or for the most part to engage in the game in a typical way, this child was allowed to run around the field, run back behind home plate, and move around. And based on where he was, that made sense for him. But the other children were really confused why he was allowed to do it and they weren't allowed to do it. After the first practice, and after speaking to his mom, who was there and really open and very helpful with some information for the other parents, we were able to go talk to our children and give them an age-appropriate explanation and let them know that he was still learning and developing, and right now, for him, that was where he was, and that was what he had to do to feel comfortable with the group and in the sport. And because they were able and had the skills to stand in their position, that would be the expectation for them. And it was put forward in a very matter-of-fact way, and then the children were like, okay, that's what he does. It wasn't a big deal. And so kind of talking about things ahead of time can always be very useful. Another thing that's very common with preschoolers is some confusion about the capability that that people with disabilities might have. So if anyone has ever seen the show Little Bill, you might remember when Monty went to school with Little Bill. And Little Bill was pushing Monty around in his wheelchair, and Monty is a family friend, and he was getting the scissors for him, and he was just doing everything for Monty. And Monty felt really frustrated, and in fact, by the end of the day, wasn't really wanting to play with Little Bill. So Little Bill went home and told his mom, he said, I was pushing Monty in his wheelchair, and I got him everything he needed, I was doing everything for him, and I don't understand, he was mad at me. And his mom said, well, Little Bill, did he need you to do all of that? And Little Bill thought about it and realized, well, no, he didn't. And so that's very common that children get confused and think, well, if the person can't walk, maybe he also can't cut with scissors. Although, of course, there is no connection there necessarily. And so we want to remind children of all of the strengths of all of the children in our classes as well. Also, it's common that a young child might fear catching a disability, and so we just need to let them know that that's not something that's possible, especially if that fear is holding them back from being able to interact with a child. And so it's absolutely common that young children, and even many adults, will lack the skills for interacting with people who are differently abled. And that's okay. We just have to figure out where the children in our class are and make sure we bring them to the next level so that they can truly grow in their understanding of others, and that we can have a true inclusive classroom where everybody is not just present, but actually really embraced and celebrated.